Chapter 1 The Dead and a Moonlight Teardrop. 1. With particular urgency, I was feeling compelled to choose a path at the crossroads of life and death. However, I was also beginning to believe my path was cut out long before I had begun that stretch in my journey. That awful place smelled like sickness, and the damp, icy air was unkind, a time when death could have been a welcome friend. That's the main thing I remember from our 78 days in captivity, of our mission in Kashmir. "We have come to collect you. We will escape you." These strange and nervous commands coming from the young guard shook me. I suppose it was apparent fear in his innocent-sounding Middle Eastern voice that convinced me that I should be fearful as well. And although I was quickly becoming afraid, his urgent conviction and confident authority brought me back to my days as a young soldier from 25 years earlier in this life of mine. But even as young as he seemed, his bark convinced my spirit that I should get up, that I must get up. A task not easily done. I'd been beaten, starved, frozen, and sleep-deprived. His cry pressed through me with the strength of a heavy ocean wave on a day the sand wants to give up and melt into glass under the wicked and close sun. And with his cry, my sleepy existence was awakened. From my given location, seated against our cinder block wall, I had thought many times of what possible scenarios could play out to give me, or give us, freedom. The last few weeks, though, it seemed like a waste of time to even consider that blissful possibility. The more likely developments all seemed to be filled with tactical planning, specific weather, and fast, deadly action. By us, the unwelcome Westerners. Westerners who were all typical suburban family men, slightly bland, but satisfied in life. A few months earlier, and you'd have thought we all went to the same barber even. Well, except for one of us. And perhaps you'd have thought we bought our clothes together at the same Midnight Madness sale. But we had more than our appearance in common. We each had a past that was stained with the blood of our enemies. Maybe not our enemies, but at least our country's enemies. Enemies of foreign war. A half-dozen of us, with a half-dozen wars to talk about, cry about, and even laugh about. Funny thing was, we didn't speak of our war records as we neared our sure execution. When we sat, day by day, habitually looking up at the hooks embedded in the poured concrete ceiling. I missed being with my wife, Nora. I missed driving with her down the country roads near the ocean, with the windows down, the warm air. The sound of the road competed with her choice of music, which was usually country and western. I didn't particularly like country and western, but I loved that she was happy. I loved that she would sing along under her breath with the occasional increase in volume. She hated her voice, but when her song lofted across the rolling wind as we drove, in my mind, I noted it was as if I were listening to an angel. Tied to those hooks were, or what once were, ropes, cut and frayed at the knot. We spoke of those hooks once. Only once. It didn't take much imagination as to what they were for. And after our captors gave us our first introduction to the hooks, they were no longer a mystery. These small instruments of brutality were a constant reminder of what was real, what was to be expected, and there was no longer any reason to even speak of them. I suppose we didn't want to. Our hands would be bound with one end of a long, white nylon rope. I imagined they must have had a giant ball of this rope in a shack nearby, and that someone took great care to pull out just the right amount, the right length, just to serve its purpose. The other end would be tossed over one of those notorious hooks in the ceiling. Then a guard, wrapping the rope's end around his forearm, and then, with all his weight, would pull. Like a hunter's fresh-killed deer, completely and utterly devoid of life, being strung up to be dressed in the front yard of Charlie Ray's trailer home, we'd each find our time of interrogation, hoping not to be beaten too much, or that if they were to go too far that day, that life would just mercifully and voluntarily find its end, that it would not struggle against the inevitable. We'd sit in that cold cell, looking up, looking at those hooks, those ropes. So, instead of speaking of the humiliation and the dreadful pain we each endured every week or so, we talked about our families, our relationships with God, while some of us, at least one of us, pondered the doubts of his existence. But mostly we spoke of the previous life, the day-to-day of when we were on free soil, when we were free men. 2. Alan constantly spoke of food. This habit of his only served to amplify the reminder that our hunger was nearly unbearable, painful. What I wouldn't do for a nice hot bowl of chowder, he'd say twice a day, at least. See, Barrett, you don't know what good food is, so you don't know what to miss. I'd look at the others during his miniature rants. Leo's mouth slightly unhinged, lips matted with thirst, face beginning to sink. Otis showing disappointment. Billy's head would wag slightly, and he'd look away. Dominic was even more easy to read. His pursed lips were so tight his chin would disappear. His nostrils flared. You could see the considerations of strangulation written on him. I'd grown to resent Alan's fast-paced voice. His cheery, New England Red Sox-loving, obnoxious way, in this unfortunate predicament, was creating in me a quiet and profound hatred for him. I thought for a while of ways I could kill him without anyone knowing who had done it. Perhaps it was only my bored imagination. But honestly, I thought him dying would have only mattered to a few people in our team, and I suppose his wife and children, although I suspected Billy and Dominic might have schemed for his demise as well. I guess it was divine providence that Alan and I were never alone. Still, my guilt pressed against my soul just for thinking it. Otis, from the first time I met him, was never just Otis to me. He was a link to a short scene of my past. I'd observed a man through the window of a bus many years earlier, before knowing Otis, before things became so... Anyways, that man with a broom in his hand, standing on the sidewalk in the morning sun, seemed in control of his life. I believed in control of a perfect life, until the day Otis revealed things weren't so perfect in his. Otis, the eldest of us, had told us through a broken heart one day, about 2 weeks prior, that the Lord had never given him and his wife a child. The general reaction among us was sympathetic. And then Alan began to speak, to respond. Oh, Lord, no, I groaned within. As when Alan always began to speak, I was fearful of what stupidity this man would say. And this time, what would he say to an old man with such a sad countenance? What could he say during a time when the oldest of us pulled back the veil that covered his darkest moments for all of us to see? Then, in a rare instant of compassion, Alan said, Otis, maybe you and Gina could take me in after we get out of here. Adopt me. I'll be your son. Otis smiled. Sure, Alan. You can be my son. I'm sure Gina would love that, he said, thankfully and with sadness, knowing what fate we surely had before us. knowing that this thoughtful offer was only to console him temporarily, if he'd let it, in his time of hopelessness. And just as surprising as it was that Alan said something so wonderful, we were brought back to what we should have expected, even in these conditions, when he blurted out, "Besides, maybe you could put me in your will. We could use the college money." He smiled proudly, like an idiot, thinking he was clever with such a remark. He glanced at each of us, looking for affirmation. We each had our own version of disgust on our face. Someone, who I didn't turn my eyes to see, through a beaten voice, muttered a sort of blasphemy just loud enough for us to hear. I remember Otis later that day expressing that he was sorry. "I had a moment of weakness. I'm sorry that I brought everybody down," he said. But it was a weakness that we all shared. At that point, we were so beaten down that any display of what could seem like courage or strength could have only come from someone suffering insanity. Since then, I've learned and accepted that things happen, sometimes as if it were a sign from above, sometimes as if it were a curse from below. 3. They killed Alan that night. Whether it was 2 days before this or 3, I can't remember now. He died in the cold night after being beaten into only a version of himself, unrecognizable. I will never forget that moment, that final moment. Billy and I had watched him take his last breath. It was a faint grasp of life through a shredded face. We looked at one another, shaken, our expressions glowing slightly by the moonlight, and then darkened entirely by the moment. An eclipse of sorts. We cranked our heads slowly, looking over at the others. Otis crawled on his elbows to Alan's side. "Alan?" he whispered, with hope in his voice. The old man was tugging with noticeable weakness on Alan's sleeve. "Alan?" he said, with less hope and more desperation that time. He leaned over the bloody patient, tilted his head with his face toward me so that his ear was over Alan's mouth. He leaned in closely. I watched Otis's hope slip away completely. His eyes open wide, fixed on his thought. He checked for a pulse one last time at the neck with the skill of an old MASH captain. He sat back on his heels. We were silent as we sat in the cold, in shock. "No," Otis whispered. "No," he said again, a little louder, dropping his head. A tear, sparkling as it reflected the moonlight, found its way down his old, furrowed, frozen face. I watched that wet, glimmering sadness meander down the surface of his salt and pepper beard. It hung suspended on the end of the last whisker, and it dropped, disappearing out of the ray of moonlight. He exhaled, saying, "He's gone. He's dead." 4. On our last day, 5 guards stood outside our door. Keys rattled. They walked in. We weren't beaten that day. Instead, they were kind to us. The oldest man, who seemed to be in charge of this detail, said playfully as a parent to a child, "Culture today." One guard, who was unfamiliar, walked past the 4 others to lay down a full platter. The floor was our table. There were 5 cups of tea on 5 saucers and 5 pieces of bread, culture. The guard placing the platter, who I'd not seen before, glanced up to see our dead friend. I'm not sure what he thought when he saw a dead body propped up in the corner like that. Following his curiosity, I glanced in the direction that he was staring, then back to him again. The guard didn't take his abnormally bright, golden-colored irises off the body for at least a count of 10. What he saw was but a shell of what was. A blanket draped over the head, curled, pale fingers pressed against the floor, and legs rigid and sprawled out into our direction. Of course, there was the rest of us, too. We looked close enough to death. I had wondered if his friends had warned him of what he was walking into on that particular detail. But maybe he knew, and I underestimated the depth of his depravity. We ate. We must have looked like starving dogs over that platter. 2 bites, and then a stuff right in, using the tea to wash it down, slurping and gulping. The following sharp pain in my stomach from the shock was worth it. "Okay," said the old guard. We nodded with appreciation. No words. He clapped twice. "Time to go." 5. We stood, looking like the most pathetic of kids standing in a lunch line, all facing the same direction. I noticed just before the doors swung open that they were marked with 2 English letters, an H and a P, as well as the Hindi script Kush, which I was pretty sure translated to happy in English. Happy, I thought. I chuckled more loudly than I should have. Then I was startled with a sudden jab of a rifle in my back. It was as if I missed the "move it" cue, a cue to which I should have grown accustomed and anticipated through these past 2.5 months. Following was a haughty command in Arabic that confirmed the harsh gesture. One by one, we were ushered into that metal box with haste. It was fastened onto the back of a landscaping truck that looked to have been retrieved from Old Man Given's scrapyard. It didn't look like any vehicle I had ever seen. It was hacked together, a Frankenstein design, no doubt, by someone with a very specific purpose in mind. No way its purpose was to heap 6 half-naked, bloodied American men, one of us dead, on top of one another like slabs of raw tenderloin being stacked in the discount case in the meat market. I approached the back of that crazy-looking jalopy. Without grace, I managed to climb to the top of that bloody pile of human flesh. The door closed. The darkness swallowed us up. I could hear the old man's voice. "Time to go! Time to go!" He clapped twice to make his point more urgent. He was in a hurry more than the rest. I heard a thump against the side next to my ear. I flinched. Then, a gear grinding, we lurched again, and we were moving. As the contraption made its way around the first corner, a spray of light illuminated, as if it were a beam from a flashlight, searching for clues. It found the one face I didn't want to see. 6. I thought it to be unusually bizarre and cruel that they left Alan's body in that cell with us. Eventually, our combined thought was that if they weren't going to take him from our cell right away, and not knowing how long this would continue, that keeping him out of any direct sunlight might at least slow down the decomposing process. The conversation alone was a portrait of horror. And besides my life, I became anxious regarding that dank space that had been our home. I knew all too well the violence of death's odor, an odor that's most experienced in its mature form. A deer who found her death leaping across a country road 5 days earlier, or a mouse that didn't escape the inside of the kitchen wall, reminding you of a scratching sound that you heard in the middle of the night a week prior. Then, the dead are remembered mostly by a lucky turkey buzzard or a swarm of ants, thankful for the cycle of life. So, our space had been invaded by this invisible intruder. The intruder wasn't making its presence known yet. No, it was still in its infancy, but I was aware. We were all aware. of the internal organs decomposing in our presence as time moved along, and it would only take a few more days before our own sinus-ripping stench would be overcome by this depraved prowler, Alan's soon-to-be bloating body. I suppose there was some humorous irony that accompanied us in that concrete box. The longer we were there, the more offensive we and the dead body had become. So I suppose that even if they had fed us something more than a sliver of date bread, even a glorious meal, with the accompaniment of this new evil incense, it wouldn't have stayed down long enough to digest, or so I thought. "Here you are, my friend," Otis said as he placed Alan's blanket over the face and upper body of our dead team member. It was a thoughtful gesture, I suppose, and sure, it showed respect for someone who's departed. But I didn't see the point, except that I didn't particularly want to look at a dead man. I mean, Alan surely didn't care whether we looked at him or not, and Otis was going to hate it when the diffused sunlight fell over the mountains, sending the temperature plummeting as we each had only one wool blanket, which measured a small person's 3 feet by 5 feet in size. Otis was always struggling more than the rest of us with the frigid temperatures. "This old black man can't take this much longer," he'd say each night through his light Alabama accent. As he shivered wildly, he'd begin to pray, asking God to deliver us. I tell you, an extra blanket would have done him good during the nights the wind blew especially hard. Still, he forsook that opportunity. His constant sacrifice and readiness to see the unseen things that would lie ahead only served to remind me who I was in comparison. 7. I had reached the point that I was no longer merely facing fear, but that fear itself had almost become complete within me, in the form of pre-death and legitimized terror. And the memories I possessed, the ones that fostered pride, had become a bearer of contrast, such as when I was recognized for my courage and honored for my service in war, many years earlier in that welcome home ceremony. Well, only reminded me I wasn't the hero I thought I once was. While in that cell, and with good reason on frequent occasion, I would scream for mercy just as the others did. But most hours, I would just sit and suffer in silence. A silence only to be broken by an occasional cough or complaint or prayer. And that silence served as a device carrying me downward, bringing me to the watery revelation of my true self, making clear to me the things I'd done, the things I hadn't, the things I believed, the things I didn't. As if I'd arrived as close to the end without having reached the end, yet still being forced to reconcile my existence. And there, in that place, was a place of which I'd sunk into a depth of depression that I had never thought possible prior. A self-hatred that I'd heard of, but to be truthful was only an unbelieved myth until then. And darkness held me there, deep in the black and cold sea, suspended in pressure that only seemed to preserve me in place, unable to fight or swim away. And a fear which was just as deep and preserved within me. I wasn't sure if I should breathe, or even if I could breathe. The weight of the water would shift, pushing me off-center, causing me to ask no one in a panic, "Which way is up? Where am I?" After some time, I could hear deep nautical sounds far off, and then cries of a girl. She was begging for whatever was happening to her to stop. Then suddenly, just as every other time I'd been taken to that place, I could feel the creatures stirring near me, sometimes brushing against me. in my tone of fear and desperation to the one standing not so far away, who was lurking in the blackness that is forever unnavigable, I'd say, "I don't belong here. Please let me go." I was without purpose, trapped in the place I'd been taken. It was while there I became convinced that I was undeserving of living life, physically or spiritually, of forgiveness and healing from God, undeserving of proclaiming any faith in such a benevolent God, undeserving of receiving His love. I could feel His judgment upon me, a ruling I knew that I deserved, and there wasn't much further for me to be taken. I'm sorry, Nora. Cassidy, I've let you down. I have failed you. 3 times I tried to call out to someone who would hear me, someone outside this unholy place. I wanted to believe I was calling out to someone with the power to help me, but I was hushed each time with the same oppressing voice, and it would be seasoned with fake sympathy, and it would be sodden in sarcasm. Don't fight it, dear Finnegan. Believe in me because you belong to me. Come, I will give you rest. I couldn't find from where the voice came, as it was coming from beside me, behind me, and in the direction of the one standing in the dark, who was just before me. These dreary moments of cognitive condemnation weren't new, but they had been coming to me more frequently. They were becoming more and more successful in clouding the warmth I'd known and held on to for so many years. All the years since I'd left my little hometown of Salt Creek, South Dakota.